Welcome everyone to this week's IPLD sync meeting. It's June 15th, 2020. And as every week, we go over the stuff that we've done in the past week and plan to do, and then discuss any open items there might be. I need to find my hackpad. So in the past week, I haven't done that much. I'm actually not sure what I actually did. I think I did a bit of JavaScript stuff as well. But most notable for us is that the blog API PR is almost done, still in review. It gets a bit distracted in the review by random things, but I hope that eventually I will get there. And so slowly getting there. And the blog API should be there soon. And then it's basically what I really want to get in. And then I really have to look like what I'm doing next. Probably something like looking to schemas or something. We'll see. Yes, I don't think I've done anything else on IPLD last week. So that's it for me. Next on my list is Peter.
Still typing, but I'll finish in a bit. So last week, Rod and Michael gave me a little simple project to add something to the Lotus CLI, which turned out not to be a simple little project. So it turns out that we basically have two shorthand specs for selectors now. One is what we have in the shorthand for schema specification. The other one is the one that Tim was working on. Neither of them is very CLI friendly at all, number one. Number two, it turned out that we do not have a good story for selectors to a point with recursion, and we spoke a lot about this with Michael. I will try to write up something like more formal, what the holdups were, but long story short, we basically will end up not doing selectors at all for the first iteration of the Lotus CLI, but instead we'll do basic pathing with a deliberately limited character set. And a little bit further in the meeting, we will have to circle back to that. Basically, if I am not using characters that, for example, Eric wants to use for something else based on this write-up earlier today. So there is that. And that pretty much took most of the week, because if you want to understand Go IPLD Prime when Eric's not here, it's still complicated. So that was my week.
All right. And next on my list is Eric.
Yeah, but in my defense, I got it to work. So.
Yeah, those things that I skimmed that you did look basically correct. So good job. So I spent a bunch of time off in the corner tinkering around with CodeGen stuff, and also doing a little bit of a change of pace. I spent some time poking around on experimental projects for what it would be like to actually be a consumer of some of this CodeGen stuff I've been working on. And I don't know if I have a ton of finished thoughts to report from that, other than it was certainly thought-provoking. So I'm going to be doing a little more review of how these systems work when you get like code from lots of different packages coming in. I think I have some new design questions to explore in the future, so that's fun. The CodeGen Mega Dev branch that's been out for quite a while now had accumulated over 100 commits by the end, and I have now landed that on master. There is also a nice table in the README for feature completeness. It contains check marks. It also contains X's. There's still lots more to go there, but it's in sync with master again. So like, small sigh of relief there. And that is my main sort of progressions for the week. I also did some speculating about path things, which I should turn into exploration report documents that can be shared. But not all of that was guaranteed good ideas either. So like, we'll see if any of that goes somewhere. Maybe more news on that later. That's about it for me.
Next on my list is Michael.
Hey, I was just writing up all my notes. Okay, so I got to write a lot of code last week. It was awesome. Okay, so JS multi-formats, the interface work is done. It's complete now. Other than moving to ESM, that was really the only thing that happened. In moving to ESM, there was some side questing involved in getting coverage working. Turns out that because in Node.js, ESM is actually provided by V8. You can no longer hook into the module system and just transpile all of the code to random things, which is how coverage was implemented before ESM. So I have to use the native V8 tools for coverage, tool called C8. And there are some corners of that that aren't quite up to par yet, but it's working enough for us to rely on it and to use it. So I moved the hundreds tool that I wrote and a lot of our coverage checking to C8. The nice thing about it is because it's native, it's way faster than the Istanbul NYC coverage tools. So that's great. That's all working now. I improved the GitHub action quite a bit. So now we do a matrix for all of our tests to test on 12, Node.js 12 and 4. I almost said 0.12 there. Rod will appreciate that. Anyway, that's all working now. It's a great piece of GitHub automation. I have now decided that I have enough of these like action YAML files for like my way of doing build, test, and release and publish phases that are impossible to keep in sync, that I'm now writing a tool to just keep all of these in sync across all the repos that I have them in. So that's what I'm working on right now in order to update all of the projects. Okay, also all the DAG codecs have been ported to the JS multi-format stuff, except for DAG PB. I wanted to wait until Gozala has some more time because he's done a bunch of awesome work there to pare it down to the data model, and I don't want to fork it until that is all complete. We also have plugins for every hashing function that we had in multi-hashing async now. So the JS multi-format stuff is all there now, and it's totally usable as long as you're comfortable migrating to ESM now. So that's good. I started working on migrating JS block over to it. That's almost done. The tests are passing, full coverage. There's just a few odd ones to work out. I need to expose some endpoints that already have some codecs loaded, and I've got to update the docs and a couple other things. But other than that, it's going pretty well. And I think that's all that there is for me. And I was also like doing manager stuff all week, but that's boring. So I won't talk about that. Rod, you're up next.
I am. Sorry, I was late. Okay, so it was a shortened week for me, a public holiday, and yeah, just lots of little things again, another one of those weeks. But the main highlights were Bitcoin docs. There's a pull request with my work in progress. It's tedious work. Busy cache progress. And the other thing I encountered was another CBOR strictness thing, which I thought we were done with, but there was an issue in Bork, our CBOR parser, somebody filed, and that's issue number 47. Turns out that Bork has will parse multiple top-level objects in a row as an implicit array, and JS IPLD DAG CBOR is doing this and only fetching the first object. So if you have a DAG CBOR object block, then it can have multiple top-level objects just smushed together without a container. So I introduced a pull request for the specs to say that's not allowed for DAG CBOR, and pull request the two JS DAG CBOR codecs to fix that. That was me.
Thanks. Chris, is there anything you want to share?
No, not really. I'm available if anyone has things to throw at me. I will start consuming the Rust IPLD stuff soon. So I just finished kind of like the thing I needed on my side before I could start consuming it. So I'll be switching over to that. So provide some feedback. I guess you did ask me to look at the multi-format stuff. So I'll look at that and see if I have anything to add.
Yeah. So in case you start looking to Rust IPLD, surely check out the current only open PR, because like that's basically a major change that gets in, and so it just makes sense to basically base it on that one, because like it's eventually getting in. But this will hopefully land this week. So yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm happy to get feedback, because like it's still like it's like based on my usage and the usage from David, the other author, and it's kind of like, yeah, pretty vague if it's a good idea or not what we are doing. And so it's good to get feedback and just like to see how it really works in real world applications. So that's great. So I'm happy to get feedback, and certainly in Rust IPLD nothing is set in stone. So I'm happy to change basically everything. So it's cool. Cool. Yeah. Anything else? I think Peter wants to chat about the pathing stuff a bit, I guess.
Yeah, I basically want to make sure that everybody who cares about this saw the actual syntax that I am using for this. I linked this in the channel last week. That basically I'm allowing explicitly only alphanumerics a dot. I do not allow the Unix double dots. I do not allow double slashes. The idea here is that I want to make sure that we're not closing an avenue to something that somebody else wants to use in the same context that I don't know about. That's all. Because obviously, once we ship this is kind of like our first selector application outside of the web gateway, and you know.
Well, Filecoin uses selectors in a bunch of places. Behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. This is like the first like user visible aside from the gateway that we're shipping. This is what I want.
Right. What do we use selectors for in the gateway?
Well, we have paths.
Oh, IPFS path. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, IPFS
paths
paths
special cases, by the way. That's
oh yeah, definitely. IPFS paths are like specific to IPFS, like.
Right. Yeah. That's my point. Basically, I want to make sure that we're not going to end up with something that's specific for Filecoin, because we didn't have the forethought to just say, you know, this thing we're not allowing right now, and if you need it, come talk to us, because we have the library.
Yeah. So something that came up in my call with Eric today that is probably I should share more broadly than just my phone call with Eric. And I think I already told Peter though. So we need to work on a path spec. We need a spec for pathing. I want to pull this out of the conversation about selectors like entirely for a minute, and just think about paths, because we continue to like ship around paths and talk about paths, and we actually don't have a specification anywhere for what they are. One of the difficulties that I've run into a few times is that we continue to sort of move paths around in terms of which layer they're addressing. So we'll talk about like paths on an ADL, like IPFS, for instance, or application paths like IPFS, or paths on an ADL, or paths in the data model, and they're all kind of different things. And then we have no kind of clear rules about them or what the boundaries are. So something that I would like to see is a path spec that has a much more narrow focus scope than selectors. So the paths would only select to one thing, right? So they only ever resolve to a single thing, which means that they are linear, and you can reason about them that way. And as we write this spec, I would like to use language. about each particle as being an operation on a node, right? As you work your way down the node tree. So that we write this path spec once, and then we write another spec that says, this is how you do pathing on the data model. And this is how these operations interact with our data model. And then if somebody writes an ADL or somebody writes an application and they want to use our paths but have other interpretations like how IPFS does, they can do that and make those decisions at their layer. So yeah, that's a kind of food for thought. Eric seemed to like the idea earlier today, but now that he's had time to think about it, maybe he doesn't. Okay, he still does. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
putting aside
up by a string interface in the Go code base is like, we're extremely on the same page about this, in fact.
Cool.
Can you give a couple examples where you've used these paths? I don't recall hearing that or reading about that, so I'm just trying to understand better.
Yeah. So a couple of places that these paths are already implemented. So these paths are implemented, I believe, in the DAG API, but also in IPFS, and also as IPFS kind of file paths. But even in the DAG API, there's like a rough kind of path spec. And what it is it's just like a bunch of, you could think of it as just like a slash separated array of values, and when they happen to be numbers, they are offsets in a list, and when they're strings, they are lookups on objects, essentially, or maps. So it's really just a way to say like, okay, I have some kind of IPLD graph somewhere, and I want to traverse through it to hit a particular point. And so here's like a string that gives you the path to that thing. And there's like, we should talk, we should think about, I don't think that we need to talk about it right now, but we should definitely think about how broad we want that spec to get. Like, I don't know if we actually want to dig into really fancy matching criteria or anything like that.
But to Chris's point, we should also talk about, why this thing exists, because it's still like IPFS is one thing, but what other consumer needs a path spec? I mean, are we going overboard here?
Oh yeah. So I mean, like this came up like this, like in the last few weeks, just because like we need in the Lotus command line, we need a way to say in the retrieval market, go and get me this file out of a car file, and you need to be able to pass it a path, which is basically relative to the content root of the car file, that paths into that car file to resolve to an IPFS file. And so like, this is actually like relatively simple in the car files that we wrote for Dumbo Drop, because it's always just like an offset in an array and that's it. But you can imagine like other structures where you have like more complicated graphs on top of a bunch of files and you want to traverse into it a little bit more. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, Peter just posted like a good example in the chat of like what a sort of really basic path looks like.
Like that's literally. Yeah, go ahead.
But that, so we need to be clear here that we've got two things. We've got selectors and paths. We still have to make a case that paths as something distinct is something we care about. Maybe selectors does everything, because I know we're bringing this baggage from IPFS, but maybe we don't need paths if we have selectors.
So no. So this is something that like actually came up in this work, right? Is that the way that selectors are designed is that they are broad pattern matching over a graph that resolve to any number of nodes, right? So once you're looking at a selector, particularly a parsed selector, it doesn't have a logical end. Like, it's not linear. You can't like append something to a selector because there's no end of it, right? Like it's very similar to GraphQL, right? Like if somebody was like handed you a GraphQL query and you were like, oh, I want to append something to it. Like there's no place to append it to. Like there's selection criteria in various places throughout the graph, right? So selectors are like this like kind of mega thing. In fact, like what I would like to see actually is selectors somewhere. Once we have a good selector, once we have a good spec for paths, for the selector spec to leverage the path spec. So you can put the paths in selectors to make them a little bit easier to write. but selectors, yeah, they're not constrained enough for us to use them in certain places. Like in this case, this has to resolve to a single file. So we have to know that this is a linear traversal that resolves to one point. And we don't have that like anywhere in selector.
Clarification though, when you say it needs to resolve to a single file, even this is ambiguous because does it resolve to the graph of the file or does it resolve to the root of the file?
Sorry, the root of the file.
no.
Yeah. That's what I mean. It needs to, I was just imprecise. Like it was not up for debate what it needs to do. It needs to resolve to the root of the file.
Right. I'm not saying that it's up for debate. I'm basically pointing out how easy it is to, get the wrong idea with the same language.
Is it true that a path is basically a subset of a selector? And can you think about it that way? Because where selector can return multiple nodes, a path will only return exactly one node. Is that correct?
So I think the subset thing can be misleading because on the one hand, it's true. And like, if you find that way of looking at it useful, then great, it's true and useful and use it. But the thing that Michael said about not being able to extend, like you can't append to a selector, that's not a definable is one major distinction, right? Whereas you clearly can append to a path. And I actually will end up using paths when I'm implementing selectors and traversals, because let's say I'm doing some traversal over a large piece of graph and I'm evaluating a selector as I do this, right? At every point in my traversal, I will have on my stack a path and just a path, right? So it's like, it is arguably a subset, but it's a very useful subset. And at any point, I think it's particularly useful to be able to take that path and serialize it. Like I want to be able to printf debug my way through these situations, and hopefully that string that comes out of my printf debugs, that should also be a reasonable thing for me to reinterpret as a path, again, in a way that I can use that as an instruction to make a specific traversal to a specific point. So some of the parts that we're missing right now, like all of our libraries that exist, they do this thing where like you've got a path on the stack, it ends up in your printfs. We haven't defined all of the escaping basically. And I think that's something that we all agree that we need to do soon.
And that kind of goes back to my question that I want to make sure that I'm not eating an escape that you had in mind.
I have so as this work is for Falcon basically, is it clear that we use paths that operate on the IPLD objects and not like having IPFS style paths? Because like if you want to have a file, you normally give it just the
it's very clear. Yeah, it's very clear because the spec interprets segments that are only numeric as indexes to an array, which IPFS does not do.
Yes. Okay. No, but I mean, like it's so also like for the use case for Falcon, is it clear that those won't be file path? But
yeah. So So like
because because like super important. Like I think it's super important because like I can see that there might be people that would like to have IPLDs, IPFS style paths.
But here's the thing, right? Like the interop and integration story of IPFS and Lotus CLI is separate enough that you really wouldn't make that mistake, right? Like if you put a file into Filecoin with Lotus, it like just wraps it up into a car file for you and it's one thing. And then like there's this command that like just works with that. And if you're generating car files and like your own graphs and putting them in, then you're gonna want to do like, you're gonna basically want to use this command line flag to pad into it. There's no point at which like you hand like a directory to the Lotus CLI and it like does all that stuff for you. Like it's actually really, really minimal right now. And the more advanced stuff, it's like people are actually like exporting a car file in IPFS, loading up that car file, and then like taking that car file and sending it back to IPFS. Yeah, so it's pretty clear, and I mean we're going to have to document it well as well. But.
Okay, cool.
And this also just needs to be documented well across Filecoin, because even beyond the Lotus CLI, the retrieval market is taking selectors in order to do selection into these car files. And if they do contain big UnixVS directories, the algorithms for traversing like IPFS directories is not actually in Filecoin or in Lotus, so that's not going to be supported.
Okay, cool. All right. Is there anything else? If not, then we've reached the targeted length of half an hour. That's cool. Yeah, cool. Then goodbye, everyone, and see you all next week. Bye.